Today we're talking about a very interesting SMITE topic, and that is damage support builds. And no, I'm not talking about some random guy in your casuals who doesn't really want to play support and just builds full damage while being the support. I've seen that often enough. And I'm also not talking about damage support picks like Naja or Cat. I'm talking about support mains on the highest level of play, the SMITE Pro League, building damage support builds, or including damage items in their support builds. Including certain bruiser items isn't unheard of on support. We have seen Voidstone being played on a lot of support, we have seen Stone of Binding, which is mainly meant for supports in my opinion, and we've also seen Ethereal Staff being built on supports in late game a fair bit. But in the SMITE Pro League Phase 1 playoffs, we saw a bunch of support players just picking these full-on damage items. I'm gonna name a few here that did that on different guards with different items. Refer did it on Ganesh with a Divine Ruin in the 5th slot. He also did it on Kuzenbo with a Spear of Desolation in what I would call the 7th slot, so at the point where he sold his Guardian's Blessing to free up the 6th slot for another item. Aurora built Voidstone in 4th slot on Terra, but in the same game, which you will see in the background, also built Spear of Desolation in the 5th slot. He did the same thing on Terra with Voidstone in the 4th slot and then Spear of Desolation in the 6th slot. And when he played Terra again, he also built Spear of Desolation in 6th slot. He actually also played Capri with Pythagoras Piece in 8th slot, but I would call that more of a bruiser item. I just thought it was an interesting side note because we're not seeing that item all too much. Polar Bear Mike also built Spear of Desolation on Kuzenbo in 7th slot, so for trading out Guardian's Blessing. And then later on, because of how the game went, traded it out for Divine Ruin. And Rongyu actually built Ganesh with Shoes of the Magi instead of Shoes of Focus as well. We can also mention Awesome Jake building Amaterasu with Stone Cutting Sword right after Sovereignty, but then Awesome Jake always had his own builds basically, so that's a little bit of a different story. So, what is up with these items? The first one that we can get out of the way quickly is Rongyu's Ganesh with Shoes of the Magi. That's just for early clear, especially with Ganesh 1, that is a lot of early pressure that you can create that way, and depending on how you want to play, that can be very useful. Obviously, it comes with a little bit more downsides later on, where you usually don't benefit that much from the power, as those characters, those guardians, don't scale that high. At the same time, with Ganesh, that aspect can be okay anyways, because his ultimate scales relatively high if you can lock enemies down for a while. But the real interesting ones here are Divine Ruin and Spear of Desolation. Let's first talk about the individual utility and then about the damage output. So, in one case you have an anti-heal item. And technically the anti-heal item that supports used to build, if they build anti-heal in the first place, would have been Pestilence or Contagion. But as it stands, neither of these items are really valued that much. And that's for a good reason. Anti-heal as a whole is a little bit flawed. I actually had made a whole separate recording on that a while ago, which I never ended up releasing, where I was like rambling about that for 15 minutes. The problem is that Pestilence doesn't really work as well as you'd want it to work. It's only a 25% healing reduction, which is lower than the aggressive options, and it requires you to stay within 55 units or 55 unit radius of the enemy that is healing. And most of the time, that's something that's just not possible consistently. The 55 unit radius is not that much. Many enemies that have healing also have some form of mobility increase that will allow them to get out of that range. And even if they themselves get reduced healing, if they can heal allies that are a bit further away, those might still get full healing anyways. On the other hand, with Divine Ruin, you have a 40% healing, and this is applied for 8 seconds, which is much longer. In the context of a fight, this is a full ability rotation for most characters and then some more after that. So that is something that will affect the entire outcome of the fight a lot more, especially if enemies try to back out a little bit and reposition to sustain a little bit. They still have to wait out this 8-second duration. And the interesting thing with many supports is that they actually have pretty decent ways to apply this to many targets through their abilities. Terra has massive AoEs with a 3 and her ultimate, as well as the surrounding effects being relatively easy to apply as well. Kuzenbo can also easily apply the effect through his ultimate to many enemies, And then even with his 1 he can get some decent range, especially if he bounces it. As far as I'm aware, the 2 does not actually apply these effects, which would make it even stronger, but still, he has plenty of ways to apply it. For Ganesh it's a little bit harder because the ult is a little bit more avoidable, but then if you avoid the ult, you are also kind of locked down in a specific place for a long time, so sometimes you might be willing to take the sacrifice, but in that case you could at least heal yourself beforehand if you haven't been hit by something else. But still, it's good enough of an item on him and easy enough to apply in most situations for it to be worth it. However, I do think that Spear of Desolation's passive is actually even more interesting for supports. Passive is, if you receive a kill or an assist on an enemy guard, all your cooldowns are reduced by 2 seconds. And as it stands for support, they are usually alive for a long time in a fight, and unless the fight is going completely horrible, that means sooner or later they will be getting assists. And those assists then give them the capability to use their ability rotations again much quicker. I think having a cooldown reduced on a mage is nice because it gives you more damage, but having a cooldown reduced on a major CC ability is often even more impactful, because that means that you set up more damage coming from everyone else, especially from your ADC as well, and that in a late game teamfight can really turn things around. This is especially beneficial for Kuzenbo, who already can reduce his own cooldowns through his 2. That way you can really almost guarantee a second rotation of your abilities in a fight and throw out multiple nenes. So what about the damaging stats and the lack of defensive stats? I think this concept somewhat resembles the dirty bubble builds around Season 2, when Mirage figured out that you actually can build damaging characters with tanky items and they still do enough damage, but kind of the other way around. What he found out back then was that the tanky stats on many items are extremely good, but your base damage values on most characters were also good enough to simply build those tanky items and just rely on your base damage to have a relatively high damage output while only putting minimal damage items into your build. Since then, many defensive and offensive items were buffed and nerfed to even this out, many base values were adjusted, but what remains is that especially Guardians still have relatively high base damage values. And that's on purpose because they also have relatively low scaling, as they are not meant to do massive extra damage through abilities, with a few notable exceptions. So why would you put damage items on them? Well, first of all, because these items are not really damage items. Spear of Desolation and Divine Ruin, of course, give you extra power, which gives you extra damage, but that is not their only purpose. They both come with their own utility that we talked about, but they also both come with 15 flat penetration. And penetration, as most of you all know, different from power, affects both your base damage and your scaling. Flat penetration is also especially effective against targets that cannot build that much defense. And now you have to consider that the base magical defense of many squishies at level 20 isn't particularly high. So taking this a little bit off that actually has a relatively high impact on the damage output. Even if the enemy support with a fully stacked Gauntlet of Thebes, which we'll often see, is nearby, this penetration actually goes right through that because the protection provided to allies by this item is 10, and we still have a 15 flat reduction on both of these items. So from a damage output perspective, a single flat pen item is very beneficial for supports, more so than even multiple power items. And as I mentioned, Aurora even combined this with Voidstone, at which point it really starts to chew into the enemy defense. But that only clears up the damage part. What about the defenses you lose? Well, you will lose those, that is inevitable. There are no diminishing returns on building protections in Smite, and combining a lot of health and a lot of protection will always make you tankier. So there is most certainly a benefit in a full defense, full health build. However, when practically applied in game, it's not always equally beneficial. If you are extremely tanky, you may just start running into situations where the enemy will ignore you, and if you don't have any utility that reduces your cooldowns at that point or anything else that allows you to be more of a nuisance than just body blocking, then your impact can be relatively low. At the same time, if you as a support are able to deal more damage, that reduces the time to kill on a target for your team, meaning the enemy will have a shorter time frame of opportunity to deal damage. And as you may already realize from this is very hypothetical. This really depends on the situation. Sometimes the enemies will just be able to burst you before you can get your damage off if you're too squishy, and then whatever damage items you had become a downside. In other situations, when your team is working together and the positioning is good, then your additional damage may be able to do more for your team than some extra defense on you. So there is most certainly no one-size-fits-all solution here, but I do think that Gauntlet of Thebes as a core item opens up a lot of opportunity for different build paths that allow you to deal more damage as well, or get other utility items of other sorts. I do think that on certain characters, as I mentioned for example in the Cthulhu guide, you can even go as far as going for the early defense, getting your Guardian's Blessing, maybe CR boots, and then Gauntlet of Thebes, and after that focusing primarily on damage items. You could for example have a build with a Void Stone, with Ethereal Staff, and with Spear of Desolation at some point, and then along with that you have an additional defense item depending on the situation. Maybe you need some more physical defense or something else. I think this is very interesting. I think this makes the support role more appealing to players that just don't like this pure defensive playstyle, but at the same time you have to know at which point of the game you should do that and in which games you maybe shouldn't do it as well. If you get bursted in every fight because your item right after Thebes was a Spear of Desolation and you didn't build any other defense yet and the item ends up being too expensive so you can't get anything else, then maybe it's not the ideal timing. If you want to test around with this, my general recommendation would be building Gauntlet of Thebes and at least one bruiser, if not one other specific defense item for the game, and then potentially looking towards a damage item. That is the earliest point where I think it works well in most games, though in many games it's probably preferable to build it a bit later. Around slot 5 to 6 to 7, I think there are a lot of opportunities to fit items like these in, and then when you trade out boots, you get another opportunity. I hope this gave you a solid overview of this unconventional but increasingly popular support style. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the sub button and maybe the bell if you want to get notified of more SMITE content. Also, if I managed to finish it in time, I watched basically all the game shows over the more recent week or so, and I'm going to summarize all of them and talk about the, in my opinion, best titles from those shows that we can look forward to this year and early next year. So stay tuned for that if you want to save yourself some time. See you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.